I made a visual novel in Godot with my wife in 1 month. What possessed me to attempt such a thing? NaNoReNo. I have no idea what this stands for, but it's like NaNoReMo, where everyone tries to write a book in November. Except instead of November, it's in March. And instead of writing a book, it's a game jam where you make a visual novel. Before March, I began plotting how I might undertake the quest of NaNoReNo. Up to this point, I've successfully made exactly one visual novel and one game in Godot, so it seemed like the obvious choice was to do both at the same time. I also had the idea in my head that I would attempt to catalog this adventure in video form as I was doing it, at which point I obviously needed to use the new hotness that is Godot 4, despite having never used it before. Surely it wouldn't present too much of a difficulty? It was at this point I ran into a difficulty, a vile demon straight from the pits of dependency hell. In my last game, The Adventures of Blanc, I used InkGD to help handle the dialogue, which is a Godot implementation of Inkle's Ink, and I thought it would be perfect to leverage for a visual novel. It made writing a lot of dialogue relatively easy, and there was a standalone app for writing ink scripts that I could give to my wife, the writer, so that she could write dialogue without having to deal with Godot at all. Unfortunately, InkGD had not yet been updated to work with Godot 4, forcing me to make a choice: abandon Ink or go back to Godot 3.5. I was not yet prepared to give up on that new hotness yet, so I endeavored to find another tool. I found succor for my dialogue management woes in the aptly named Godot Dialogue Manager, which did essentially the same thing, except without the external application. With that, I felt like I had the equipment needed to set forth. All that I needed yet was a plan for an actual plot, and this is where my companion, Ava, came to my aid by taking care of that for me. With this: imagine, if you will, a woman on the way home from a tedious office party comes across a mysterious Victorian mansion. The alluring lights draw her in, and upon entering, she seems to have been drawn back into the mansion's past. To her right, a party seems to be going on with people in Victorian-style attire, and before her is a strange table with what appears to be a riddle. Upon solving it, she is approached by a comely butler who beckons her deeper into the mansion. And then, well, you get the idea. If you need to pause the video to go play it right now, I would understand. A sensible thing that all good coders do is to come up with a solid architecture of how their code should be structured, and then execute on their carefully laid plan. Unfortunately, I am no such coder. I've found that if I plan too much with these sort of things, I become vulnerable to the anxiety basilisk, who will then paralyze me with its overwhelming stare of unknown unknowns. So charging onward it is then. I saw two main paths before me. In my last game, which was a top-down action-adventure Zelda-esque affair, I made each area its own scene and just changed the route scene when the player traveled to a new area. The game had several puzzles in it, so I figured that each puzzle and the text leading up to it could be analogous to an area that got its own scene. I thought at first I might be able to avoid having the dialogue need to talk to the code. The thing is, most of the puzzles that were essentially dialogue options were managed by the dialogue manager. This meant the code for all the chapter scenes ended up being essentially the same. Load in the visual novel scene and display the background. Once I had made a couple of areas, I noticed I was making a lot of very similar scenes. The shadow of tedium was encroaching on me, and I knew it was going to get worse. I was also quickly realizing I needed the dialogue to be able to send signals back to the chapter scenes to change the backgrounds, show and hide characters, and summon sounds and such. I knew if I let the tedious bits grow in strength unchecked, I wasn't going to make it through the month, so I set about to curb this evil. Out went the chapter scenes, and it was replaced with a scene simply titled The Game. I compiled all Ava's dialogue into one novella of a file, and put flags in it that I could use to jump to the various bits in the dialogue. I then added 2 files of globals, or in Godot speak, auto-loads. The first was a state file that saved all the variables I wanted to check, such as the personality points for the endings. The second was just a series of functions that the dialogue could call that would emit signals that the game scene would listen for and then react to. This way, I could essentially control the whole game from the dialogue file. file. I had a function for changing the background, another for playing music, for showing characters, so on and so forth. For the nodes involved in doing any of the specific puzzle magic, I simply added them to the game as children, made them invisible, and then had the game scene listen for signals related to them to make them visible again. I'm under the impression that the proper way to handle this is to put them in their own scenes and then have the code instance them in and destroy them as I needed them, but I didn't do that. I understand it'd get unwieldy if you had a lot, but I only had 5, and just toggling the visibility was sufficient for this little project. Being as enchanting a wizard as I am, I obviously follow the KISS principle. You know, keep it simple, stupid. One major feature I knew I needed for it to be a real game was the ability to save. The correct thing to do would be log the current line in the dialogue, what events, characters, and backgrounds were triggered, along with everything in the state, and save that. But that seemed like too much effort. Instead, what I opted for was to add in a checkpoint system. It felt unconventional for a visual novel to have checkpoints, but I was here to make bold, new innovations. There wasn't that much dialogue between puzzles, so I figured I'd just save everything immediately after the player solved one. This meant I had a finite number of states that I had to worry about the player jumping in on, and so there was less opportunity for vile bugs to sneak in. As a concession to try and make it up to the player, I added a slight input delay every time you got to a set of dialogue options so that the player would have a chance to react if they were just mashing through the text as fast as possible to get to the next decision point.
Hi, I'm Ava, and I did the plotting and writing for the story. The game includes many riddles, so I also wrote those. So if anyone can't figure out the last riddle, that is my fault. The plot actually came to me as a dream, which it was a cool dream, so that was a nice freebie. Usually when writing stories, I come up with the characters first. Because Gary had to draw everything, I limited myself to 2 characters, the main character, who isn't even seen, and the butler. Sometimes stories are easier to write when you have limitations, so that gave me some focus. After having the plot and the characters, I gave my protagonists problems. The main character obviously has riddles to solve, so you can enjoy the game just solving the riddles and getting to the end. But depending on your response selection, you'll get more of the background story, where you find out that she and the butler have personal problems that need solving. The truly fun part of this project for me was writing 3 different character responses while keeping the main story the same. So you can choose the snarky responses, the witty but reserved, or the romantic flirty responses. These don't change the main story, but your responses direct which ending you get. This was a nice exercise because I wanted it to feel like a choose-your-own-adventure novel. Because the art depended on the story, I felt like I needed to write it first. So I finished the manuscript in about 20 days, and in the meantime Gary worked on necessary art. My regret is that the story ended up needing so many backgrounds. Gary didn't get to finish as many details as he would have liked. But we're still married, so it's okay.
Another aspect of creating a miniature reality is the aesthetic one. This is the part that gave me the most dread from the onset, and that I have the most regret around having finished. For context, I like doodling. Most of my school notes had marginalia. As an adult, I've made a few attempts to learn to draw more realistically, mostly around sketching portraits, and attempted to learn how to Bob Ross in Procreate because I can't be bothered to buy painting materials. Over the past year, I've spent a lot more time making pixel art. This game, on the other hand, required drawing a lot of interior rooms and a hot anime guy, neither of which are my forte. I basically split all my images into 2 stages, a sketch and a finished product. My sketches were incredibly rough and just gave the general idea of the place, and imported those into my game as I finished them to use as a placeholder art. This worked out well for me, because this meant that my anxiety attacks I was having over needing to make art that I was going to post publicly didn't hold back progress on the code being developed. Essentially, whenever I got to a place in the game where I was going to need an art asset, I took a break from coding and spent my time sketching anything I needed. This is one thing I really appreciate about game dev. I can work on one thing, like coding, when the mood hits me, and when that starts to get tiresome, I just switch to doing the art assets, vice versa. I can work on these wildly different activities, but they both contribute to the same goal. As the month progressed, the art started lagging behind where the code was. I was also very dissatisfied with how plain all the backgrounds were turning out, but also knew that I simply lacked the time to attempt to render anything with any particular detail at my current art skill level. I had been aggressively using symmetry to my advantage, but I needed more. From my internet free falls, I had seen that some people would model rooms in 3D first and then paint over it in an art program. That seemed brilliant and would maintain my pretentious artistic integrity, but I couldn't 3D, and now wasn't the time to learn. One of my problems was perspective. It's quite difficult to draw things accurately that are sitting at a distant angle from the viewer. But then inspiration struck. What if I just drew the thing straight on, and then just transformed it to be at the angle I needed? Before, I would try to draw something in perspective, realize it looked off, and then had to start over. But this way, I could fiddle with the angles until it felt right. Now, this worked brilliantly for some things, but others looked a bit flat. This was a sacrifice I decided needed to be made, so I started using this technique aggressively as well, and that sped up my art production significantly. So I had gotten my rooms laid out, but they still looked rather bare. Procreate has a Victorian brush that makes this pattern that I would just paint over an entire layer and then angle it to be on a wall. But if I used it everywhere, it would get repetitive fast. I didn't want it to be too obvious what I was doing. That is when I remembered that royalty-free textures exist on the internet. I found some and then angled them as I had done before, and voila! Plain rooms suddenly had intricate wallpapers and carpets. When drawing the butler, I had different issues. I felt like drawing something too cartoony wouldn't be the correct style for the type of story we were telling, and I knew trying to draw a full-on portrait would both take too long and then clash stylistically with my relatively simply rendered backgrounds. I thought at the time that trying to go for an anime-style character was the right move, despite me not really having arted in that style too much. I've drawn far more people than I have room, so I was able to get him made relatively quickly, but he just lacked a certain... I'm not sure what word describes what I'm trying to say here, so I'm going to go with appeal. I've seen some really appealing anime-style characters, and mine just wasn't. I'm not immediately sure why. I would need to just try again changing things here and there until something felt better. If you see what's missing, please let me know in the comments. When developing this, I focused on getting the game to be technically completable. I figured that having a really sketchy game that you could get to the end of was better than a more polished game with more features that ended 3/4 of the way through the story. This was a good choice. Once I knew the game was completable, I felt as if a huge weight was lifted off my shoulders, and I could technically turn it in at that point. I was able to spend the rest of my time working on things I knew would just make it better. And if something tragic happened and it didn't get done, the game wasn't ruined. As it is written, you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. It was at this point I added some last-minute art, I hunted down some music, I made the aforementioned checkpoint system and the achievement icons on the title screen. If I had had my act together better, I would have sketched out all the art ahead of time. Granted, if I took that line of thought far enough, I should have gotten better at art beforehand, which isn't really a helpful road to go down, so we'll leave that there. During the event, I was on the fence about whether I should draw the protagonist or not. On the one hand, I had the thought that, being a first-person narrative, I should leave the protagonist up to the player's imagination as a sort of self-insert. On the other hand, having a cute protagonist that I could put on the cover art would have been nice. I ended up not, mostly because I just ran myself out of time working on other things. In retrospect, I wish I had gone ahead and drawn her. For one, the best self-inserts have no personalities, and while our protagonist could have wildly different personalities, they were pretty well defined if the player picked consistently, so that was kind of a moot point. I suspect more people would have played the game too if I had two characters I could put on the cover art. Which brings me to the next thing I should have focused more on, the first impression marketing stuff. I put off setting up the itch.io page until the last minute. The thumbnail and the itch page itself are the first thing potential players see when encountering the game, and I admittedly didn't put a lot of effort into it. I think it would have also helped significantly if I had gotten the web build to work, but alas, I didn't figure out how to get Godot 4 games to run on itch until very recently. Another thing that I would have done differently is give up on the pretentious artistic integrity and hit those royalty-free assets harder and sooner. As it was, I didn't even start looking into doing that sort of thing until the very last week of the month. I could have made a more visually impressive game if I had incorporated some more royalty-free textures and such into my own art sooner instead of needlessly feeling like I needed to do everything myself by hand like a true artist. But alas, pride is hard to let go of. How did I do? Well, the jam didn't have an official rating, but I got about 22 plays in the first 2 weeks, and as of writing, gotten 5 5-star reviews, over half of which weren't even people I know. So when all is said and done, this was the most wildly successful game I've ever made. That is, until Ludum Dare 53, but, well, maybe we can talk about that next time.